Good afternoon, folks. It's a pleasure to be here today. As the title on the slide indicates, and I guess I should make reference to the title of my talk, and then after that we'll go wherever we go. Modern American Conflicts, Perspective of a Veteran of 5 Wars. I've been to war 5 times, going back for 6th. I guess I'm a junkie on the subject. But I have a lot of experience from a practical perspective as an intelligence officer, as a soldier for a lot of years in warfare, and in the first half of my career in preparing for war, and the last half of my career going to war pretty regularly. Been to Bosnia a couple times, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq a couple times, and not necessarily in that order. What I'll do today is talk a little bit at the beginning, but I really see this as a conversation with you and me. I do have some experiences that may be of interest to you, and so please don't be shy about asking questions, because if at the end of 50 minutes or so I've been talking continuously and it wasn't about what you were interested in, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan or prisoner treatment or war or American wars or the future of those, then I will have missed the mark and wasted your time, and that's certainly not my intention. Did anyone, I talked with my daughter Christine's class in international law Thursday. Anybody there for that? Okay, no repeats there. If I had any jokes to tell, then I could repeat them. I guess a few from the ROTC, maybe from this morning, and then this afternoon's class, and then other students that are here. Let me begin with just a picture here in a stage setting. And is this being recorded? Do I need to stay near the mic? Anybody know? I'll stay reasonably close to it. I'm told the map isn't often referred to, so I'll refer to the map for a second. We've got Iraq here, Afghanistan here, and those are the 2 theaters that at the moment U.S. and many troops of other nations are fighting what is called in an umbrella sense the global war on terror. And this is what that war looks like today and in the recent past. A little difficult to see here, but this picture was from a video taken off of a Canadian light armored vehicle. That man right there is a suicide bomber. A few moments later, he walked up to a Jeep-like vehicle a little further back in the convoy, blew himself up and killed a Canadian soldier and hurt a couple of others. Down here is another fatal attack. These happen to both be in Afghanistan. A landmine that was planted deliberately recently. This is not an old mine from the Russian-Afghan wars or from the Afghan civil wars. There was clear evidence that this was recently planted. Again, a couple of soldiers, international soldiers, Canadians again in this case, although we had other nationalities killed, were killed in this mine attack, and the vehicle, the Jeep behind it, was heavily damaged. This is a remnant from a more fortunate incident. A command detonated mine just barely missed one of our convoys. The guy just misjudged his timing and didn't hit anybody. Those sitting there looking like they're just sitting loose are 5 rockets, 107 millimeter, which is about 4 inch in diameter. They don't look like much, but with a car battery, a gallon can of water afloat, a little hole in the bottom of the can, some wires for run the circuit, and you've got a timing device, and those rockets will go off a mile or so in a rough direction. Obviously, they're not terribly accurate. These happen to be pointed at the Kabul International Airport. So this is kind of the face, in a way, of war that American and international soldiers are fighting at the moment, and will be, in my estimation, for years to come. Now, this is what Iraq looked like a couple years ago. When I was part of 5th Corps, I was the Deputy Intelligence Officer for U.S. Army 5th Corps, which was the western part of the main ground force attack into Iraq. And this is the scene as I saw it as we went to Baghdad. And unfortunately, this is just a little too high in the projection here. That was a sign as we were leaving Kuwait, put up by the Kuwaiti government. And in the gold or yellow at the top of the sign, it says, "God bless American troops," put up by the Kuwaiti government. These are Iraqi children smiling and waving as we proceeded north. A couple of Arab men, a mother and her 7 children who came in Baghdad, who came out to see, and a little difficult to see from the distance there, but she and the children are smiling and very friendly. And we had essentially no sense of hostility from the populace. Somebody did take a few pot shots at our convoy about a half an hour later as we were going to the camp we were at. But for the most part, pretty friendly. Obviously, that's changed a lot since we were there. This is Afghanistan, place where I got this email. I'd arrived at Baghdad and figured I was going to be there a few months, and I got this email. Good news, you're coming home. Bad news, you're going to Afghanistan right away. So I had to come home, pack my bags, and go with the NATO headquarters that I permanently belong to Afghanistan for a 6-month tour as the chief of intelligence there. And you see, these are recent pictures. So in some ways, there isn't a lot of change. The women with the burqa, very common, although you'll see more uncovered. And Afghanistan at the time I was there was equally dangerous to Iraq, even as the insurgency started spinning up in Iraq. Our casualties, the NATO non-U.S. casualties, the American casualties in Afghanistan, we were taking casualties at about the same per capita rate as the American forces in Iraq during that period of time. It's kind of my experience that the number of casualties you take is in direct relation to the number of troops you have committed if you're in a hostile environment. If you've got a guerrilla fight, the more troops you commit, the more casualties, but you may need those troops to win the fight eventually. Double-decker bus, kind of typical way of getting around Afghanistan. Very common way of getting around. Beautiful, beautiful country. President Karzai, probably as close to an indispensable leader as there can be. For a predominantly Latter-day Saint audience, you certainly don't leave your faith at home when you go to war. This are Latter-day Saint groups. This was the first group at our camp in Baghdad in April of 2003. This is a group of Latter-day Saints in Bagram in Afghanistan in late 2003. This was a field chapel that we had in Kuwait. These are two chaplains, a Catholic and a Protestant chaplain, holding open-air services immediately after Desert Storm, the day of the ceasefire. And that was our sacrament table during Desert Storm, kind of set up in a tent there with an M16 nearby. But you don't leave your faith at home, nor should you when you go to war. Okay. What is war? Let me talk about that a little bit, and then you guys can start pinging me with questions. War is a contest, a conflict using armed force between two or more sides that have aims that are important to them, important enough to fight over. And as I told the students Thursday, there's another definition that my favorite author on war, Karl von Clausewitz, one of the definitions, and he has several about war, but that war is, and you've heard it many times, war is the continuation of politics by other means. I'm told by those that speak German far better than I that a better translation is war is the continuation of politics with an admixture of other means, the other means being violence or force. The wars that the United States has been involved in, and if we say modern wars, since the Cold War, the last 15 years or so, have been, as all of our previous wars, driven by political objectives. Our enemies have political objectives, we have political objectives, and they're in conflict, and we're using armed force to resolve the issue. It's an unfortunate reality, but we have not, as a human race, in the worldly sense, found a solution to that just yet. So, sadly, war is part of the fabric of how societies deal with one another, and in all likelihood will continue to be part of the fabric of how we conduct international relations. When a person goes to war, and this is particularly for the ROTC cadets and those that may sooner rather than later find themselves back in the military and going to war, on an individual level, there are three things that you go through. The fear that you may be killed, the fear that you may have to kill, which is a very great fear for many folks. That's worse than the fear of being killed themselves. Or the fear that through some mistake that you've made, that others will lose their lives. Innocents, fellow soldiers, as the case might be. And every soldier, American, non-American, and I've been to war with a lot of soldiers from other nations, go through those same emotions, and they change people. But whether it's the individual or the larger group that is going to war, they are serving a cause that they are willing to fight for. And that is equally true of our enemies in the global war on terror. Al-Qaeda and their affiliated groups have some very concrete and specific objectives. And the objectives are not kill Americans for the sake of killing Americans. Their objectives are to get us out of the Islamic countries, particularly out of the sites of the holy sites in Saudi Arabia, but elsewhere in Islamic countries. Get us out as foreign occupiers, as infidels, as perverters of the truth, as you will, to also replace the, as they see it, apostate and corrupt regimes in those Islamic states. They are just as much interested, Al-Qaeda and their affiliates, of getting rid of the Saudi government as they are of getting us out of Saudi Arabia. Their third objective is to restore the caliphate, the centralized direction of all Muslims worldwide, with some grandiose ambitions beyond that. It is a recognizable set of objectives, not unlike the objectives other groups in previous wars have fought for. Their methods are unconventional because they don't have the means for a conventional army. They're using terrorism, which is war against non-combatants, as their principal tool, and hope that using terrorism they will cause the United States and other Western powers to get out of the Middle East so that they can then have a good chance of overthrowing the governments that they believe need to be overthrown. They have a very clear and well-articulated set of objectives that aren't actually that hard to understand, and they're quite open about what they're after. So it is not random violence for the sake of violence, by no means. It is purposeful violence. It is a form of war intended to impose their will on us by wearing us out, demoralizing us, and causing us to leave. And with that, I think I'll pause for breath for a second and give you guys a chance to, if you got some questions to ask about the war with Iraq and intelligence and treatment of prisoners or whatever, the war with Afghanistan, or just war in general, and I'll go on as long as you guys care to talk to. You got to get on to your next class. Yeah.
How large a group is Thaden? Do you really believe that they're driven by jihad or by this religious thing, or do you think that just some people are buying into that while there's leaders who have some other objectives or a different agenda? I mean, people talk a lot about that.
Well, it's very difficult to assign motives to people that you don't know really well. I mean, really, really well. However, I have no reason to doubt the sincerity of Osama bin Laden and his close associates who believe in their vision and their understanding of what Islam is all about. I will give them credit for being sincere in their beliefs, that they believe that Western values are decadent and corrupt, that our influence in the Middle East is, to put it mildly from their perspective, inappropriate and unhelpful to the progress of Islam as they see it, and that it is justified in their lights to use force to expel us from the Middle East in particular and other Islamic areas. It is, as an intelligence officer, it's a dangerous thing to assume or believe that your enemy is irrational, unintelligent, and particularly if you look at Al-Qaeda's leadership. These guys are well educated. Many college graduates, graduate degrees, many others with at least some college. These are smart, determined, rational enemies. They use suicide bombing as one of their tools, or suicide attacks as 911. But even suicide attackers are not irrational. They expect that it is worth their sacrifice. Some are duped, some are tricked, but most are persuaded that the sacrifice of their life is a worthy endeavor to support their cause. And leaping in a kind of unexpected direction on suicide, if you will, the most common most common event that American soldiers in Vietnam and other wars are awarded the Medal of Honor is for leaping on a hand grenade or explosive device to save their fellow soldiers. If that isn't throwing your life away, sacrificing your life, not vainly, they're saving other people, but it is not merely an Islamic or Middle Eastern thing to sacrifice one's life for a cause that you think is worth defending. So I meandered a bit. I hope that answered your question. Yeah.
You're talking about there, and I hear a lot of people draw parallels between the war in Iraq and the war in Vietnam. Like, what do you see as similarities, and what do you see, and how close do you see those, or do you not see it really paralleling at all?
Every war has its own unique features. There's some very major differences between the Vietnam War and the war in Iraq in particular. Vietnam, you had an external state that was, for the most part, a sanctuary militarily for guerrilla and regular forces to infiltrate into South Vietnam. You had a sanctuary there. For most of the war, Cambodia and Laos to the west and northwest were sanctuary areas. Soviet Union and China provided significant material support to the North Vietnamese. So there were a lot of external geopolitical factors that entered into that war that don't quite play the same way in Iraq. Iraq, there is some external support, not official state support, not a major power in the same sense that the Soviet Union and China provided backing to Vietnam. So that's a major difference. The ideology, of course, is different, and we're fighting multiple enemies in Iraq, another difference. Vietnam, it was throughout the war a north-directed, fairly coherent single enemy with the Viet Cong as an arm of the North Vietnamese, although they had somewhat their own aims. In Iraq, we've got the Sunni insurgency, Ba'athist, secular. We have Zarqawi and other Islamists, more fundamentalist in orientation. They both want us out, but if we were to suddenly beam out with a transporter, they would, in all likelihood, be at each other's throats just as quickly. And then you have the Shiites. So there are huge differences there. The fundamental similarity is popular will, national will, is the ultimate determinant whether you win a war or lose a war. If the U.S. population says we're done, we're done. And that would be, as a soldier, a former soldier, my great concern. In the back there, you had your hand up.
I was wondering how you felt about the Bush administration. They decided not to follow the mine ban treaty and have reserved the right to use anti-personnel landmines in Iraq. How do you feel about that?
I'm not aware that we've used, other than Claymore mines, which is a command-detonated mine, anti-personnel mines. The United States has reserved the right to use anti-personnel mines in Korea, in particular, because of the concern there with the North Korean threat. We have command-detonated mines. They're called Claymores that are used in Iraq and other theaters, have a wire attached to them. They are not mines that you step on and a child or someone can step on it and set off. Anti-personnel mines in Korea kind of situation may have their value. They're not particularly beneficial, but command-detonated mines, when you have an attack of a threat of an external force, can be a necessary tool. Yeah.
You mentioned that the situation had changed on the ground in Iraq with regard to the friendliness of the people towards the American soldiers. What do you think the cause of that would be?
American soldiers are there. Foreign occupation is never a popular thing. And frankly, the United States made significant mistakes in the early days after the war. We squandered a lot of goodwill, and we failed to impose order quickly enough, forcefully enough. And I'm not saying that in a sense of martial law and necessarily shooting looters and that sort of thing, but we did almost have a hands-off approach, and we certainly did not have initially, even though the force flow was getting more troops there quickly, we didn't have enough troops in Baghdad right away to really sit on the looting and the problems that occurred there. But foreign troops are never popular in whatever country they're in. There are always tensions, even if there isn't violence. And of course, in Iraq, there's continuing violence. And it does happen. It's sad and unfortunate. It gets into that third fear I mentioned of, through mistake, causing the loss of life of innocents or fellow soldiers. But we don't always hit the right target. And even when we hit the right target, sometimes innocent people are killed or hurt. Sometimes the people we capture aren't bad guys, although after some time in our hands they may become bad guys. I did have some hand in causing the capture of mid-level terrorist leaders in Kabul. I sleep comfortably that they probably were terrorist leaders, but did I have the evidence to convict them in a court of law beyond a reasonable doubt? Not even close. And there were Afghans that I had some confidence in that said, you got the wrong guy there. And we had to make the best call we could. Well, if we were wrong, sooner or later we'll release that guy, and he will have, and his family will have significant bitterness towards the U.S. So with good intentions, unfortunate things can happen, mistakes can be made on the best information you've got, and that erodes the support you've got. After World War II in Germany, there certainly was the perception very quickly of a Soviet threat. So U.S. troops in Germany were far better accepted over the long haul because they were seen as necessary by the German people as a bulwark, a defense against the Soviet Union, and less so, but similarly in Japan, which also was concerned about in the Far East a Soviet threat, particularly after the Korean War. It was evident that there would be aggression there. Iraq doesn't have that same sense of an external threat. Iran does not pose a threat of invasion, so the popular support will go down. Let me get somebody else and we'll come back in a bit. Yeah.
Kind of twofold. First off, which experiences in the past do you think are most applicable to this? I mean, things like Banana Wars or American-Indian Wars. And second of all, which allied conflicts do you think we can learn the most for and apply those lessons to what we're doing right now?
Boy, there's an open-ended question. I'm not a historian. I'm a practitioner. Actually, you do mention some legitimate historic examples there. And the Seminole Wars in Florida, for instance, in the early mid-19th century, the Philippines insurrection are certainly relevant American experiences that we had some success with. The British experience in Malaya is by many recommended as a positive example. Perhaps for less fortunate lessons, the French experience in Algeria is relevant. Our own experience in Vietnam is not without relevant lessons to this fight. If you were to look at defeating an insurgency, there is an author named Galula whose book published, I believe, in 1964 has been recently reprinted. And forgive me, I forget the exact title. I think it's Modern Insurgency, Theory and Practice, something along that line. But Galula, beginning with a G, it's about $20 for a thin paperback. Well worth reading if you're serious about studying insurgency and the theory behind it and how to defeat an insurgency. Yeah.
One more thing real quick. Do you think there's a lot of similarity between kind of the religious motivated insurgencies and the politically motivated insurgencies you saw back in the 60s and 70s? Do you think they operate the same way, or do you think it's kind of a...
In a practical sense, yes. Every war, as I said, has its own unique features, but you can't invent out of whole cloth a completely different way of fighting. As I mentioned this morning for the ROTC students, in my view, broadly speaking, you have conventional war and unconventional war. Conventional war, armies, navies, air forces, and space forces fighting each other, not necessarily in completely traditional ways, but each side recognizes that the other side, guys with guns in uniform or wearing some sign that indicates that they are a combatant fighting each other. Unconventional warfare, guerrilla warfare, and terrorism, I think, are the two predominant pieces of that. Guerrilla warfare, in my view, is unconventional warfare by a force that is hiding either in difficult terrain, mountains, forests, jungles, or among the people, or both, and do hit-and-run attacks. Terrorism, very similar, except the targets are civilian instead of military. So I draw a distinction there between guerrilla warfare and terrorism. Terrorism is war against civilians, however conducted, whether someone delivering a car bomb or whether somebody, if it's on purpose, dropping bombs from an aircraft. If the purpose is to kill civilians, that's terrorism, in my view. And I lost the thread of where I was going with that, to tell you the truth. Close enough? And far back.
Being one who will be deployed relatively soon, I'm curious what you were able to do, especially with the new technological advances that happen, to stay close to your family. And maybe your daughter could say what your family on this side was doing at the same time, because I'm sure you were gone for a long time.
Something that has changed dramatically, and I'll back up one second. What I told my soldiers after Desert Storm, it just kind of crystallized one day while I was with them and going to pick up mail, is that the 3 rules of soldiering are: if you've got mail, read it; if you've got food, eat it; otherwise, sleep. And for a soldier, a simple soldier, that's about as basic as it can get. Well, what was the first rule? If there's mail, read it. Well, what has changed is the technology. My father, World War II veteran, send a letter, it goes by sea, and some weeks later it would arrive. And by then, at war, the whole situation could have changed. They couldn't say where they were and could have been killed in combat by the time the letter arrives. What we have now, and most soldiers, at least sporadically, and many more often, get access to email. And that's probably the most common tool that folks have of getting in contact with family at home. So if there's mail, read it. Is if you get to a computer, check your email, send a note home, see if anybody sent you a note. The military does try to make available the opportunity to phone home as often as possible, and there are arrangements that you can make where that can be done at a lower cost, but obviously that can be a little difficult. And at least acquaintances I've had the unsettling experience that they're talking with a parent or a loved one, and then there's an explosion nearby, and it says, "Sorry, Dad, I got to go." And then it says, "Are you okay?" And they call back later, and if they're okay, and they say they're okay. But email is probably the biggest single way of keeping in contact. Snail mail, conventional mail, still very much welcome, very much welcome. I could not overemphasize how important it is to soldiers to get mail from home, however it arrives. Conventional mail or email, phone calls when it's possible. Yeah, I saw other hands up. Yeah, far back.
In regards to your perspective on the Iraq war right now, I know they don't really give timelines a lot of times, but according to what you think, you said for many years maybe, but when do you think the U.S. might be pulling out of that? And then I guess the follow-up question would be, what do you foresee as the next conflict? Is there going to be another one that's up close, like with Iran or something?
Okay, good questions both. World War II ended in 1945. That's 60 years ago. We have troops in Germany to this day. We have troops in Japan to this day. Korean War ended in 1953. We have troops in Korea 52 years later. We will be there as long as there's an Iraqi government that's willing to have us there, probably for quite some time. Now, is it controversial or contentious that we have troops in Germany or Japan or Korea? Not really. If you get to budget issues and strategy, enough. The real issue is there a conflict going on, and how severe is that conflict, and are Americans dying or not? We have been at war with Iraq or in Iraq for 15 years continuously already. Desert Shield began in August 1990. A few days later, during that period of the build-up in the Gulf, President Bush said, referring to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, "This will not stand." While we did not begin offensive operations until January 1991, we were, in essence, at war with Iraq from that point. We were conducting defensive operations in anticipation of an Iraqi attack that fortunately did not occur into Saudi Arabia. But those soldiers in Saudi Arabia in 1990 were drawing combat pay and were very much at risk, the first few guys, because they referred to themselves as speed bumps. They had no tanks, they had no heavy armor, and the Iraqis had a lot. Desert Storm ended 91, says, war's over, right? That was a ceasefire, and if you recall, almost immediately we imposed on Iraq the northern and southern no-fly zones, and we had American combat aircraft armed, flying in those no-fly zones essentially continuously for the next 12 years, very frequently getting shot at and shooting back or dropping ordnance on Iraqi air defense. Low intensity, in a sense, no American casualties. There certainly were Iraqi casualties over those years. We were, in effect, at war with Iraq throughout that period. 2003, conventional operations to destroy the Iraqi army, overthrow Saddam Hussein, throw him out of power. And now we're in a subsequent phase where we've got a nasty insurgency that will take some years yet to defeat. I'm guardedly optimistic. In war, nothing is certain, but I'm guardedly optimistic that we will win. We certainly can win. Whether we will is an open question. And then I expect we will have troops there for some significant period of time after that. Once it's no longer an insurgency, it really won't be controversial. There's not great controversy, although it's just about as dangerous, frankly. There's not great controversy over the troops in Afghanistan. There's no controversy over the troops still in Kosovo who are drawing combat pay. But there is obviously about Iraq because of the numbers involved and the perceived, and it's pretty intense, particularly in western Iraq. The fighting can be quite intense, so that becomes a very controversial issue. I hope that answers the first question. Second one, which war is coming? I've given up forecasting that. The strategic intent of leaders will really determine that. I don't, as I told the class this morning, I don't have a sense, and I spent a lot of time doing intelligence in positions where paying attention to whether countries were going to go to war was part of my bread and butter. I don't have the sense of impending war between the United States and Iran, or the United States and North Korea, or the United States and China over Taiwan. Could any of those three change quickly, depending on events? Certainly they could. I like to remind my students at Fort Leavenworth, where I'm an instructor between vacations in the Gulf, or maybe the other way around. I have to decide. In any case, call me crazy. In 1933, January 1st, I believe it was British defense policy, and had been for some number of years as they were planning out their budget and their strategic situation, that they did not forecast a major war for the next 10 years. And each year they'd revalidate, okay, it looks good for the next 10 years. What happened a few weeks later? A guy named Adolf Hitler came to power. And within not that many months, when you really get down to it, by 36 things were, I think that was when the Rhineland was reoccupied, 38, Anschluss, Munich, and so forth. And by then it was already too late to stop World War II, the question how bad it was going to be. And by 1939, 6.5 years later, Germany was near superpower status, virtually unstoppable, certainly on the continent. And it was an open question. It's easy with the benefit of hindsight to say, oh, they never had a chance to win. But there were points where different decisions, if Churchill had not become the leader in Britain after the fall of France and other issues, if a different, less determined leader had become prime minister, it's not at all certain that we would have won World War II. And that was a 6-year span. So to predict out 6 years from now, will China be a threat or not? Will North Korea go to war with South Korea or not? I wouldn't even care to predict that beyond a year. It's just, I'm telling you, my sense is war with those three powers is not imminent. It's in neither of our interests. If Iran were to really trigger war, Iran's regime would be destroyed. Whether or not we could handle the aftermath is another question. The same is true of North Korea. And China and the United States don't want to fight over Taiwan. It could happen someday, but we don't want to. I hope that answers your question. Next, yeah.
This may seem like a simple question, but I like to hear the opinion of an officer as opposed to like politicians on Fox News. What exactly would you say are the reasons we ended our military?
Boy, that's a good question. I could tell you why I went. I didn't have to go. There certainly was. I'll answer that on several levels, or at least attempt to give it a shot. Iraq, Saddam Hussein was a megalomaniac and an aggressive one, a narcissistic megalomaniac, I think some author called him. He had attacked and invaded Iran. He had attacked and invaded Kuwait. He was certainly perceived to have been a threat to invading Saudi Arabia over the course of his regime. He had made very seriously threatening noises to Jordan at one point, and on another occasion it had seriously threatened to go to war with Syria. The only neighbor he didn't invade or seriously threaten at some point was Turkey, and Turkey militarily really was too hard a nut for him to attempt to hope to crack. So he was aggressive. He was a brutal dictator. If you haven't studied Saddam Hussein, it is interesting to look into his persona and his approach to power. And he looked up to Stalin as an ideal, and Stalin probably killed 20 to 30 million of his own people in famines, purges, and other events. Saddam Hussein was ruthlessly brutal. He certainly had beyond question, weapons of mass destruction. He was far closer to a nuclear weapon after Desert Storm than we realized before. We knew he had a program, but he was way closer than we thought he was. He had chemical weapons. He'd used them both against Iran and against the Kurds inside Iraq. And there's no doubt he also had biological weapons. The world intelligence community was unanimous in the view that he had weapons of mass destruction. I certainly believed that as well as anybody else, and I had access to fairly sensitive intelligence. That was a reason. But as Edmund Burke is quoted as having said, he actually didn't say it, he said something close, all it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. I chose to get involved in this particular fight because I thought it was the right thing to do to remove a brutal dictator, and it was politically possible to do it after 9/11. I mean, I'm delving into politics and not just a military view, but it was politically possible after 9/11 that the administration could, U.S. administration, could build the case and sell it domestically, and there was a better chance of selling it internationally than came off, and we made some diplomatic mistakes that made that worse, I believe. But certainly the case could be made that Saddam Hussein could not be tolerated. Should he have been removed earlier? Arguably, perhaps yes, but you get into the issue. Iran was a major concern at the end of the first Gulf War, actually the second Gulf War. First Gulf War was Iran-Iraq, which I deployed for as well. Second one was Iraq-U.S., and now we're into what we call the third one. Typically we call it the second one, but I refer to it as the third. So difficult situation. When are you going to remove a brutal dictator? Do you let him stay there forever and brutalize his own people and act as a threat to the region? Or do you remove him at the time it's politically possible to do so? I can't get in. I don't know what the internal motives of the folks that influenced the president and the president's decision-making were, that this was the time, but I believe it was politically possible in 2002, 2003, after the 9/11 terrorist attack, to do that. Was Saddam Hussein involved in terrorism? Certainly with the Palestinians. Beyond question, he was involved in supporting Palestinian terrorism against Israel, paying significant sums of money to the families of suicide bombers and other support. Absolutely he was involved there. Was he involved with 9/11? I've never seen any credible evidence that I thought he was, but there certainly were responsible people who believed that he was or had some linkage there, and that would have influenced the decision-making. So there's a variety of reasons that I think come together. My own motive was to get involved, to do what I could to help remove a brutal dictator that, given a chance, would brutalize either his neighbors or his people through the future, and whose two sons were at least as bad as he was. And we call these countries republics, but many of them are essentially monarchies. When you hand power to your son, that's a king and it's a central dictatorship. I think we should call it the Kingdom of North Korea. Kim Jong-il, Kim Il-sung, and they pass from father to son power. Saddam would have passed power to his son, and that would have not improved the situation one whit. So I hope that answers a little bit the question. Yeah.
How about, they say Iraq, well, we found no weapons of mass destruction or anything, but one thing it is serving for now is sort of a magnet for people who are interested in fighting the U.S., and so better to fight them there than fight them here. Can you talk a little about that and whether it's working that way?
Well, certainly, as against the Russians in Afghanistan, that those that bear ill will to the United States and our friends, Afghanistan is a great place to go do that. Iraq. Afghanistan as well, but less so Iraq. Iraq more so in greater numbers. That is happening. I guess if we as looking at from a military perspective, and in here I'm still wearing the uniform even if I'm not here, it may be as good a place as any, but in the long run, the survivors there will be very dangerous guys. The initial folks that we fought in Iraq weren't particularly, they were courageous, but they weren't particularly bright. The stupid guys are dead. The guys that we're fighting now have learned, they are cunning, and those that survive and decide to apply their trade as soldiers or terrorists outside of Iraq will be very dangerous folks. So the cost-benefit analysis, that's hard to say. I don't think we had to have as serious an insurgency in Iraq as we've had. There was inadequate planning and inadequate execution to be charitable for the post-war activities, and so we have a worse problem. Nobody set out to, let's create a magnet for jihadists to come so we can fight them there. It happened as an unintended consequence of not having control of the borders adequately and not establishing a security early enough and firmly enough to prevent an insurgency from growing. So it's not a good thing we've got that insurgency. Some of these guys will come other places and we'll have problems elsewhere. Yeah.
What does, for Iraqis, what does it mean? What's the meaning of democracy? Do they know that? And what would be our role, the United States, in helping with that? That's important.
Yeah. Well, that's a hard question. I hope to be able to answer that a little better in 7 or 8 months. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
And see, I'm coming from a country where democracy was given to us and also through support from the U.S. as well. And it was hard for the population to know and grasp the meaning of what democracy was. And I don't think they still know it.
That'll take several generations. There wasn't time today, so one of the things that I'm not showing in the slideshow is a very powerful video taken for the first Iraqi elections. And you may have heard some of that, but you have to understand how utterly determined the bulk of the Iraqis were to get out and vote. In the elections that elected the provisional authority or provisional assembly that then wrote the Constitution, there were cases of suicide bombers who approached voting lines with the intention of killing as many people as they could, and Iraqi policemen, individuals who saw this guy was suspicious, grabbing the guy, holding him to him, and walking him as far away as he could from the voting line before the guy blew both of them up. There were cases, and fortunately there weren't as many attacks as were feared, but there were attacks. At least one suicide bomber did get close enough to cause some casualties in a voting line. Now, think here in Provo or any place in the United States, if a suicide bomber blows himself up in a line on Election Day, and what's going to happen? Well, what happened there is within minutes, the line had reformed. Within minutes. And the voters, as they were waiting to go in to vote, were spitting on the corpse of the suicide bomber and went in to vote. Do they really understand Jeffersonian democracy? Of course not. Do they understand that for a generation they lived under a brutal dictator and now they have some chance to influence their future? Yeah, they get it. Will it be pretty clean, Western-style democracy? No time soon. Will there be corruption? Sure. The Deputy Prime Minister Chalabi is a crook, convicted in absentia in Jordan, and I'd like to see him extradited. But so it's not going to be clean, pretty, no hanging Chad kind of elections in Iraq. But is there room to step by step over years, decades, generations for the Iraqis to have a better future? Yeah, I think so. Is it really important for the Middle East? Yeah. Will it work? I think so. But the ballot's out on it, and a lot of it hangs here. If the U.S. says we're done, then we're really done, and that'll be a catastrophe. Worse for the United States than the loss in Vietnam. Much worse. Yeah.
I'm kind of curious why, as we've been talking, you're talking about the people spitting on the corpse of that suicide bomber and situations like that. Why do you think that the Iraqis don't see the insurgency and terrorist attacks on civilians as a threat that would make them be more friendly towards the United States?
Well, there's a couple parts to that. One is Iraqis in general are not supporters of suicide bombers. Certainly the Shiites and the Kurds have been the victims, more so than American soldiers, of suicide attacks. But even in the Sunni community, there is starting to be some segments that are turning against suicide attacks and terrorism as an approach to have some degree of influence. Remember, the Sunni for many years were the dominant tribal, it's not really ethnic, but the dominant groups in Iraqi politics. And it's not easy to let go of that. And some of the folks fighting us are from that leadership body of the Ba'ath Party who are fighting to achieve whatever degree of power they can. But there are some Sunni that are starting to come to the conclusion. And I'll forget the name again. Zarqawi got the letter from, what is it, Zawahiri, telling him, Al-Qaeda International to Al-Qaeda Iraq, this suicide or these suicide attacks on Muslims, these beheading of Muslims, isn't working. It's a bad deal. This is a terrorist leader telling a terrorist leader, you're going too far. Terrorism, as I told the class this morning, strategically in the long run doesn't work. Yeah, you can kill people. Terrorist attacks work in that sense. But achieving your larger aim, it doesn't work. Terrorism inflames, enrages the victims, the enemy, the survivors. They fight you harder over the long run. So I don't see great success for terrorism. I think one question, real quick. Well, let's see, you've had one. I'll go over here, and then we'll come back. I think we got to wrap it up. You guys got other classes or whatnot. Yeah.
If you look at the people who supported the invasion of Iraq, and you read things like the National Review or the Weekly Standard, the right-wing press is trying to understand what's gone wrong in an invasion that they supported. And there are kind of three broad stories. I'm just curious which one you think is right. There's actually four stories. One is the problem was the Pentagon. In particular, people like Paul Bremer, he thought he was General MacArthur, did a terrible job of setting up an occupation. They ignored the State Department. Another is that it's sort of a combination of the CIA and the State Department that didn't understand Iraq, and therefore, as a consequence, didn't do a good job of planning. It's not the execution. It was screwed up from the start because the planning wasn't good. And the third story is it's the White House fault, starting with people like Jay Bybee and others who wrote memos saying the president could do whatever he wanted to do, and therefore people who work for the president could do whatever they wanted to do, and therefore we're discredited in the eyes of lots of people around the world because we look like thugs running these things in Abu Ghraib and elsewhere. The fourth story is there's nothing wrong, it's all working out fine. That's Victor Davis Hansen's story. Which, if any of these theories, do you subscribe to?
1, 2, and 3. Politics and international relations are complicated stuff. I don't watch sports. Football's too simple. If you want a complicated sport, watch international relations, watch national politics. There you got a serious sport. Where's the playing field? What are the rules? I'm going to have to wrap up, but there's truth and elements to all three of those. I can hang around, but I think you guys got to go. What I'm going to do is let me just run, and for those who got time, there's a powerful video here. Friday was Veterans Day in the U.S., Armistice Day in the rest of the world. I think you may enjoy this if I can get it to run. Thank you very much for your time.
Good morning, shoppers. At 11 o'clock on this 11th day of November, we'd like to invite you to share with us 2 minutes of silence. Good morning, shoppers. At 11 o'clock on this 11th day of November, we'd like to invite you to share with us 2 minutes of silence in honor of our veterans. Good morning, shoppers. At 11 o'clock on this 11th day of November, we'd like to invite you to share with us 2 minutes of silence in honor of our veterans.
They fought and some died for their homeland. They fought and some died, now it's our land. Look at his little child. There's no fear in her eyes. Could he not show respect for other dads who have died? Take 2 minutes, would you mind? It's a pittance of time for the boys and the girls who went over. In peace may they rest. May we never forget why they died. It's a pittance of time. God forgive me for wanting to strike him. Give me strength so as not to be like him. My heart pounds in my breast, fingers pressed to my lips. My throat wants to bawl out, my tongue barely resists. But 2 minutes I will bide. It's a pittance of time for the boys and the girls who went over. In peace may they rest. May we never forget why they died. It's a pittance of time. Read the letters and poems of the heroes at home. They have casualties, battles, and fears of their own. There's a price to be paid if you go, if you stay. Freedom's fought for and won in numerous ways. Take 2 minutes, would you mind? It's a pittance of time for the boys and the girls all over. May we never forget our young become vets at the end of the line. It's a pittance of time. It takes courage to fight in your own war. It takes courage to fight someone else's war. Our peacekeepers tell of their own living hell. They bring hope to foreign lands that hate mongers can't kill. Take 2 minutes, would you mind? It's a pittance of time for the boys and the girls who go over. In peacetime our best still don battle dress and lay their lives on the line. It's a pittance of time. In peace may they rest, lest we forget why they died. Take a pittance of time.
Many serve. I think that Canadian was one we lost in Afghanistan.